Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by longtime anti-fascist blogger Bob From Brockley. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You join us from the blogosphere, care of South London. Could you tell us a little bit about why did you start blogging and how long ago was that?
Well, it's just almost exactly my 20th blogging birthday, which is a bit of a scary thought. I guess it was at that time, a couple of issues, early 2000s. I had a small kid, so I was moving out of activism. I was maybe becoming a bit more of an armchair activist, and it was an outlet for stuff, get off my chest that I didn't have so much time for. And it was also a time, it was the aftermath of 9/11. There was a bit of a shift in the political culture, shift in the nature of the left and the far right. And I was very disillusioned with lots of my comrades and wanted a space to express that. I guess I first thought I was, talking to about a dozen people, and very slowly over time that grew. I guess I see my mission as analysing the far right, analysing the left's response, but maybe talking to a left-wing audience primarily, but perhaps with some dissatisfactions about how the mainstream left works.
I was going to say, have you become re-illusioned with the British left in the subsequent 20 years?
Maybe sometimes in some ways and not in others. I've probably spent the 2000s perhaps moving a bit to the right, and then with the economic crisis of 2008 and the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, moving back to the left. So I'm pretty much where I started in the 90s now. Anarcho-Marxist, militant anti-fascist.
Bob, how has the left in the UK dealt with the far right over the course of your blogging? What's changed over the course of the 20 years you've been doing it?
Well, I guess there's been a few phases. I mean, I became active in something called Anti-Fascist Action, AFA, in the late 80s, which survived into the end of the 90s, which was militant anti-fascist two-track approach to fascism, confronting them on the street so they can't organise physically, but confronting them ideologically with the idea of presenting alternatives to the maybe white working class audiences that might be drawn to them. That movement was fizzled out at the end of the 90s, partly as a victim of our success because we'd driven them off. The British National Party was the main fascist grouping in the 1990s, and we basically drove them off the streets. And they shifted their approach to maybe one that was more community organising in neighbourhoods where people were really disillusioned with the Labour movement, with electoral politics, and they shifted to an electoral strategy which we weren't really able to cope with. And I think it took a long time before anti-fascism found its feet again, which was probably in the period of the 2010s with the rise of the English Defence League and its various splinter groups, which were maybe not explicitly fascist in the same way that something like the British National Party was. So it was a bit of an ideological challenge to think about this different form of far-right politics. They were much less organisationally united. They were popping up all over the place. And so at that time, I think the left, there's been two main responses. So the mainstream left, led by groups such as what used to be the Anti-Nazi League, Unite Against Fascism, now Stand Up to Racism, which is dominated by VEX, a Trotskyist party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and Breach is a very broad-based populist trade union funded, them mobilizing on the street with placards, and then a more militant, probably anarchist-led movement, which will confront fascists directly and maybe is the heir to that AFA tradition, which has always been overshadowed by the larger trad left Popular Front type strategy. So there's been a bunch of different strategies. And I think now, I mean, we can maybe talk about this more in terms of what's happening with the far right in Britain. Now the strategies that worked against the English Defence League might not work so well in the current moment. So there's probably a period of soul searching that's going on now.
Bob, last year saw anti-migrant riots across the UK. Could you tell us a little bit what you've observed in terms of the responses to those from the left and from anti-fascists?
Yeah. So in the summer, August 2024, as you probably know, there was various bits of disinformation that were rumours, lies that were spreading about the perpetrators of a crime against some young girls in a small town, and this blew out of proportion on social media. Different groups of far-right activists were gathering in all sorts of locations across the UK, targeting accommodation centres where asylum seekers were living, legal practices that worked with migrants and refugees, just assembling on the street. There was attacks on mosques, there were attacks on hostels, and there was a huge climate of fear. People that were maybe visibly Muslim or non-white really afraid to be on the streets for quite a bit of time. And there was one call to protest from the far right that circulated a bizarre list of locations across the UK. And this then got very wide circulation on the left, very broadly defined, and huge numbers of people came out and to counter-demonstrate, and the actual far-right presence was pretty tiny in the second round. So there was a wave of violence, and then there was a very strong, peaceful response by very broad-based anti-fascist, anti-racist citizens. It wasn't really organised by any group of those locally on the ground left groups. Stand Up to Racism in particular did mobilise people in local areas, but it was organised really spontaneously on social media. And so there was quite a heartening large-scale response on a one-off basis.
Since then, Bob, I've been reading that it appears that the state has cracked down quite heavily on a number of individuals, hundreds, who've been held to be responsible for racist acts of violence and the circulation of materials on social media. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think part of the context of the far-right activism is a narrative that there's what they call two-tier policing. There's a conspiracy theory on the conservative and radical right that basically the left, but Black Lives Matter, animal rights activists, environmentalists are allowed to get away with anything, whereas they're policed heavily. In reality, the opposite is the case. Most far-right mobilizations are very lightly policed, whereas climate protests, for example, are very punitively policed. And so the policing response has been quite politicized. So the government had a difficult task of showing that they had sort of zero tolerance for racist violence without fueling this two-tier policing narrative. And some of the methods that they'd used in 2011, there were riots across the UK, discontented youth that were treated quite punitively when Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, had a role in the justice system. The criminal justice system have been reused. So there was quite a swift and hard response to the far right, but it's worth noting that many of the judges involved were also given pretty hard sentences to some of the counter-protesters. So prison sentences for people a couple of people that got involved in counter-protests. It definitely wasn't one-sided. And I'm also, lots of liberals were very happy about this punitive policing of the far right. But to me, it's not necessarily a strategy that the left should get behind. to put in prison, radicalise. I mean, I don't have any sympathy for the violent people that were imprisoned, and I'm happy that they're off the streets, but in prison they're going to be radicalised further. The political challenge isn't stemmed. In fact, it's strengthened. The two-tier policing narrative is going to be strengthened. The conspiracy theories, the sense of persecution on the far right. So in the longer term, politically, that punitive response. So in the short term, it's hard to be unhappy about that punitive response, but in the long term, it might not be helpful.
And what would you say what sentences have been handed out to say mainstream media organisations that have stoked racist fear in the UK that led to some of this stuff happening?
That's a good question. The mainstream, I don't think there's really been any, I might be wrong, but I don't think there's been any real consequences for the mainstream media organisations that have been basically spinning misinformation about the scale and nature of migrant presence in the UK for years. And then the most probably dramatic example is GB News, which is a TV channel that's basically modelled on something like Fox News, a highly partisan right-wing news outlet that broadcasts lots of conspiracy theories, and as far as I can tell, is really getting no proper regulation. So there was some individual social media users that spread disinformation who've been kind of taken offline, and I think there might have been some legal sanctions against them. But the mainstream media that are basically echoing the same stories have gone untouched.
Funny how that always happens.
Yeah.
We've also seen more recently, Bob, the quite conscious and deliberate intervention of the richest man on earth into UK politics and the stoking anti-migrant sentiment. That seems fairly significant. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think it is significant. I think it's worth looking at how these stories migrate between social media, kind of street networks of rumour, and mainstream media. So the most recent wave of far-right anger that Elon Musk has intervened in is around a long-term news story around so-called grooming gangs. There's a small percentage of child sexual abuse cases in the UK that are conducted by groups of predominantly Pakistani background men in a few towns across England. And over the years since about, I think, 2012, there's been one investigation after another, one report after another that's revealed the scale of these and have revealed some failings in the policing of them and in the support given to the young women who were targeted. So this is an old story, and it's an old story that's recently been picked up in particular by GB News, this right-wing internet TV channel. And I think it's from there that it reached Elon Musk's ears via, the algorithm that he's created on his website, which seems to be designed to basically radicalize him further. And then because he picked it up as significant, all of the right-wing would-be influencers jumped back onto that bandwagon. The key feature of the far right in the UK at the moment, two related key features. One is that there aren't strong organizations on the far right. What there are is a number of figureheads and influencers, and then a large number of wannabe figureheads and influencers who are each competing for attention in the attention economy, the entrepreneurs of panic, who are each competing to tell a more scary story for basically clout on the internet. And then Musk has plugged into that network, and so things spiral very quickly. The other key feature, I think, of the far right in the UK at the moment is the complete collapse. It's never been a solid wall, but it's now non-existent, a wall between, on the one hand, mainstream conservatism and the radical right, and on the other hand, the wall between the radical populist right and the actual fascist right. Those distinctions are collapsing daily, and we can see in Musk's intervention, like part of the dynamic behind that as members of the Conservative Party, formerly a mainstream centre-right party, are now competing with people from Reform UK, which is a radical right populist party, and with actual hardcore fascists to present themselves as the most anti-migrant, the most tough on grooming gangs, the most tough on Muslim migrants. And so, partly competing for Elon Musk's attention, partly competing for this sort of audience of angry conspiracy theorists who take up a large part of the UK social media consumer audience.
Bob, we can also see the same sorts of divisions collapsing in not only in the UK, but across Europe and elsewhere in the world. What's the relationship between, as you understand it, between the far right in the UK and elsewhere in Europe?
I think that there's quite dense networking and organisational level among the structured groups on the far right, some of whom are funded by Russian money, some of whom are connected to very, well-organised far-right networks, some of them more connected to US groups. And then at a lower, more spontaneous level, the flow of social media networks is very transnational. People in the UK are no longer, the far right in the UK is in an ecosystem, an information ecosystem that's global. And so very rapidly US-focused moral panics and conspiracy theories get absorbed into the UK discourse very quickly. And I don't know if there's some that also go back in the other direction, but, the idea of wokeness, of DEI, like in Britain, the term DEI is not used in any organization. They say EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion. But for the far right, they just take up the US American version. Similarly, drag queen story time's not really a phenomenon in the UK. It's been taken up as a moral panic from the US. So both at an organizational level, but in particular at an informational level, there's very dense networking globally, I think. There's maybe a couple of features of the British far right that are distinct. I mean, the nostalgia for empire, sort of Ulster unionist, loyalist, sectarian culture, some aspects of football culture, and maybe a lack of a strong Nazi subculture that maybe make Britain distinct from other European countries, but a lot of the dynamics are very similar. So we don't have a big electoral vehicle at the moment for the far right as they do in, say, Germany or Italy or France, but the same dynamics are playing out within mainstream political parties.
Bob, in the United States, we've seen those same areas becoming greyer between the fascist right, the radical right, and sort of mainstream conservatism. One of the challenges that is faced by people attempting to blur those lines is that, there's a cohort within that who want to name the Jew. They want to make anti-Semitism the centre of their platform. And at the same time, you have this real issue about needing to support Israel in order to progress, the apocalypse for Christian nationalism and so on.
Yeah.
How is that sort of dichotomy tackled in the UK? Are they running into the same sort of problems?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's a fault line on the far right. I think it's always been the case. Anti-Semitism has been at the heart of the British far right since its inception, really, the kind of proto-fascist groups of the 1900s that were really focused on Jewish migrants. In the 30s, it was the main theme of the fascist movement. Since World War II, the discrediting of Nazism and also the arrival of British, imperial subjects and citizens from the Indian subcontinent, Caribbean and so on, the far right publicly has placed non-white migrants as its main enemy, and that's, alongside fifth column of the left and various other enemies, queer people and so on. But this anti-Semitic core, at the esoteric heart of fascism, has largely remained in place. And so people that are recruited into the far right through conspiracy theories or through anti-migrant sentiment, sooner or later will be inducted into into Holocaust denial and extreme forms of anti-Semitism. At the moment, because those organized fascism is not the strongest component of the soup of far right activism, there's a tension between those for whom the Jew remains the main enemy, who often articulate their anti-Semitism in the language of anti-Zionism. And you do see some far right activists, not in huge numbers, but a small number of key far right activists who are, for example, going along to Palestine solidarity marches and trying to push anti-Semitic discourses within that scene. And on the other hand, a much larger current of maybe more populist, less hardcore fascist far right activists for whom Islam is the main enemy, Muslim migrants are the main enemy, who are often drawn to Israel as a sort of symbol of hawkish, violent confrontation with Muslims, and also like to wave Israeli flags as a way of sort of trolling the left and the Muslims. So it's a very skin deep pro-Zionism, but it has drawn in a few people from within the mainstream Jewish community who are feeling very insecure in the context of a rise of anti-Semitism in the wake of the war in Israel-Gaza, who are drawn to seeing these parts of the far rights as their friends or their defenders or their allies. And this is a really, really dangerous alliance. And it's gotten some kind of legitimation from mainstream conservative parties as one of the ways they push it, some of these populist hot button topics of seeing the Palestine solidarity activists as jihadi terrorists and so on. So there's a dangerous alliance going on between mainstream conservatives, the far right, and parts of the Jewish community who are drawn into that discourse. Whereas on the other hand, there's just remain a hardcore far right who are much more explicitly anti-Zionist.
Bob, another group that you have tended to have a look at in your blogging, the grey zone left. Could you tell us, with the downfall of Assad, how are they feeling?
Yeah, I think they're in pain. Support for the Assad dictatorship is a really interesting case of the way. I mean, I was talking about strange and dangerous alliances before. I guess one of the dangerous alliances and convergences that we've seen in the last decade or two has been between bits of the anti-imperialist left and far right, including those parts who are actively supported by Russian money and Russian media networks, but not just those around support for the Assad regime. The Assad regime in Syria was a rallying cry both for parts of the anti-imperialist left and for most of the far right, and a few key influencers really, really pushed that convergence. And one of the groups I've been maybe a bit obsessed about is a media channel called The Grey Zone, which is US-based, which has been a big supporter of the Assad regime, a big denier of its crimes. And one of the myths that this faction has promoted is that the Assad regime was somehow secular, that it protected minorities and that it was popular with minorities, and that the opposition to it was some mixture of jihadis and Zionists. And some of the very groups that were almost supportive of Al-Qaeda and its war with the US and its allies in the 2000s have now been, for the last decade or so, have instead been speaking the language of the war on terror to legitimize the opposition in Syria. And so I don't think that because they believed their own myths, they didn't realize how fragile and weak the Syrian state was. It was completely reliant on being propped up by Iran and Russia, and with Iran and Russia occupied elsewhere with their own wars in Ukraine, Palestine, and Lebanon, basically the regime has just crumbled, and we've seen like Syrians from every minority and ethnicity jubilant at the fall of the dictatorship, and some of those Assad apologists rushing to either claim they were never actually supporters of the dictatorship all along, or falling out badly with each other over their blaming whoever they can for their defeat.
Jubilant at the end of the dictatorship, but absolutely no concern for the end of the free holidays for the YouTubers. It just says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Bob, when you're looking at events in Syria, in the UK, the anti-imperialist left, all these kinds of strange, seemingly political alliances and developments that are taking place and have over the last 20 years or more, do you think it's productive to apply an anti-fascist framework? What does it mean in terms of examining both, domestic politics and what's happening elsewhere in the world? Is there some way in which it can be applied consistently that, I guess, avoids falling into the trap of the so-called anti-imperialist camp or various other political cul-de-sacs that are unproductive and, unhelpful?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's a big question. It's one I feel really strongly about, but also struggle to articulate in some ways. I think that a large part of the left has seen the world fundamentally structured around the bad guys of US imperialism and its allies, and have allowed themselves to be seduced by various characters who present themselves as alternatives to that, or as the resistance to that, some of which are equally or more conservative, authoritarian. Some of them are outright fascist. And so this kind of campist understanding, the dividing of the world into rival camps and throwing in support with the other camp, I think has really hindered the left's ability to commit itself to consistent internationalism, to identify an independent, autonomous working class perspective on politics, and to resist forms of authoritarianism on both sides. And I think Syria was like a really key revealer of that dynamic, that parts of the left that allied with the Syrian dictatorship rather than with the revolution in Syria, because they saw it as somehow a challenge to the imperialist camp. And Syria has been really central to my worldview precisely because it reveals that contradiction, and trying to pose the question of how we can bring some kind of consistent internationalism, consistent sense of regime change from below back into the Western left, and develop a consistent anti-fascist politics rather than this campist good versus evil worldview.
Well, Bob, we'll have to leave it there. If people want to find you online, your blog is at broccoli.blogspot.com, or you are also on that newfangled social media, Bob From Brockley at Blue Sky. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to talk.
Well, Andy, that's our show, and this is our first show of 2025, so we've got quite a few to get through. And we'll catch you next week.
We will. Thanks for listening.
Come along to the Tunaminaway and Morbalhina commemoration, midday, Monday the 20th of January, at the Tunaminaway and Morbalhina monuments at the corner of Franklin Street and Victoria Street, the city. The monuments, which were established in 2016, honour 2 First Nations people from Tasmania who were executed for resisting white colonisation. Ceremony begins at 12 o'clock. At 1 o'clock we will walk down silently to the Queen Victoria Market, to the place we think their bodies were interned. Commemorate the 183rd anniversary of the execution of Tunaminaway and Morbalhina. The first hour of the ceremony will be broadcast live on Community Radio 3CR.
Sunday, 26th of January, marks Invasion Day, and 3CR's First Nations broadcast team will be bringing our annual Invasion Day broadcast to the airwaves between 9am and 4pm. We will be broadcasting live from Camp Sovereignty and throughout the day, bringing you voices of the elders, truth-telling, critical discussions with grassroots activists, deadly music, and honouring warriors past and present in the struggle for land back, an end to the genocide, and a sovereign treaty. So keep it tuned to 3CR on Sunday, 26th of Jan, from 9am to 4pm. Brr.